Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is the pre-conference session for the World Conference on Qualitative Research, and it's the 7th annual conference, and it's going to be in a hybrid format. So you may have gotten some communication about it. The in-person is going to be in Portugal, and then there's going to also be an online option, which I think that they're doing both, a synchronous online option and an asynchronous online option, where you can pre-record your presentation and actually put it on a YouTube channel for people to view and leave comments on. So it has a lot of flexibility. And so this pre-conference session is designed to kind of bring us into the spirit of the 7th annual WCQR. And Dr. CohenMiller and I have planned a international kind of informal conversation. The idea is that we will discuss the topic. We have a few questions, so think about it as more of a guided conversation than a scripted presentation or prepared question answer session. So we're hoping that that is interesting for everyone, more informal, more conversational, and then we look forward to hearing what the participants have to say afterwards.
So great. I'm really looking forward to this. All right. So we have, thanks so much, Liz, and thank you all for being here, joining us from, I was writing down some of these countries, right? So South Africa, Angola, Australia, Ireland, Philippines, Nepal, France on a high-speed train, right? And Portugal, the US, and Kazakhstan, of course. So I'm Dr. Anna CohenMiller, and I am a faculty member at the Graduate School of Education out in Kazakhstan in Central Asia. And I want to also just give another thank you to the World Qualitative Research Conference, especially Sonia Mendez and Fabio Freitas here, who have just been putting together so much of this wonderful work, and then all of you for being here, this opportunity today to chat with y'all. So, okay, let's see if this next slide will come up. How does this work? Good. All right.
It looks good. Looks good, Anna.
Great. So we were going back and forth. So as Liz and I kind of look at each other, right? We met just a couple weeks ago, and have learned of each other's work and the relationships that we have across our work, and this wonderful, like the collaborative nature and the way in which we both come about similar topics. So we came up with these kind of 3 guiding questions for ourselves, or these ideas. And so we thought that we would kind of take turns on it. Liz, do you want to, would you like me, I could ask you first, you could start us off?
Or no, why don't, since you've already done a little bit of an introduction for yourself, let's talk about your scholarly journey first, kind of build on what you said, and then I'll jump in.
That sounds great. Okay, so thanks, Liz. So my scholarly journey, right? I was thinking about this, and I often like to come back to it, and was chatting with my 11-year-old today. They were preparing their own kind of talk for their school, and it made me think about, like, okay, so where do we come from? Where do these ideas come from? And for me, my work is situated strongly within equity and inclusion, and in particular in education. And these ideas, at first, like the surface level kind of things, it's like, oh, well, this came because I care about equity and inclusion, right? I have children. Before that, I cared about it. I'm identify as a Sephardic heterosexual woman, so Sephardic being Spanish and Jewish. But then I start to unpack that more. And if you were here at the World Conference for Qualitative Research, the beginning of the year, I talked about this idea of what we talk about in qualitative research of positionality, right? So, well, where does that really come from, right? Like, why do I really care about it? And that's where this foundation, the scholarly journey started for me, where I think about, oh, okay, my ancestors actually had to leave the Iberian Peninsula by force, and another side of my family, they had to leave also Germany and Russia, Hungary, Ukraine area, not out of their own choice. And the idea then of my experiences of growing up being othered and feeling different and not fitting in and not fitting in and not in different cases being safe. And so those ideas situate my work and ground everything that I do and how I think about the world. And yet it didn't turn into the scholarly journey until my dissertation study, where I became pregnant. And this is a lot of personal information, and this is a lot of things that I talk to my students also about, where it's like, if we don't get a chance to understand who you are as the reader, as the participant, as the community member, then it's really hard to develop trust. And yet it's a hard thing to be vulnerable and to be, here sharing across the world, right, about who I am and what that means then for me, what it means for others, and having to take into consideration, what is safe, for instance, for my students to share, for other early career researchers to share. And so when I became pregnant, to go back to that, in my journey in my PhD program, a couple other people in my program also became pregnant, and we had drastically different experiences. And yet what became clear is that basic kind of thing. So I was in the United States, and there are no systematic policies in place to support doctoral students or graduate students in general as when they become pregnant. There are federal policies to help those in certain kinds of jobs once you have been in a position for a certain amount of time that you can take leave. Usually that leave is then considered a type of, it falls within what's called the Family Medical Leave Act, and it's equated the same as like if you broke your leg or you have an illness. That pregnancy is kind of on the same level is how it's regarded. And so I started to recognize this and started to recognize that there were, started to unpack it. Well, what was going on with other people? What was happening with me? And I realized that, in some cases, faculty members were great. And they said, oh, okay, you're feeling really sick, right? You have morning sickness, or you're about to deliver a baby, no problem. Yes, of course you can miss class. Other faculty were different. They said, no, I'm sorry if you miss class. Do you miss, the participation? No, you can't turn in things late. So these really varied ways of approaching it. And so that got me into doing a study and looking at this trajectory. So for me, a lot of my work focuses on mothers in academia, in particular those at the beginning of their career. So doctoral student mothers in academia, what does this pipeline look like, and how we need to actually extend the pipeline from talking about, that when you first get into academia, often as an assistant professor or a lecturer, and then moving up into a full professor or a reader, these various positions. And so to extend that to also recognize that if we want to be inclusive, if we want to recognize who is in our midst, then we need to look at everyone. So that's been, the basis, and I don't want to talk too long, but I'll wrap up in about 30 seconds then here. So from that, then I've had a chance to work with first generation students working at a university that's a Hispanic serving university. So that's federal terminology in the United States. Then working with Indigenous Afro-Latino students, young children across, so working from preschool up also to higher education, and then moving about 7 to 8 years ago to Kazakhstan and helping to build the university and the research capacity here. All focusing then on how is it that we develop and build community and build this trust, being able to be vulnerable, yet recognizing what is our own, how do we go on that fine line of ensuring that we're safe? How much can we say? At the same time, being vulnerable, recognizing our power and privilege throughout all of this. So a lot of words there, and a lot of a journey that I'm happy to go in more and to read other questions. I see some things coming up in the chat, which I can't pull up at this second, but so I want to actually pass it over to Liz. What about you and your scholarly journey? What has informed your work?
Thank you, Anna. You said you must understand who you are, and I think that really resonated with me in connecting to my own experience. I'm from a small town in Georgia that was entirely Christian, and we had one Catholic church that was on the outskirts of town, and they were the other Christians. They were, because everybody was Protestant Christian. And so when I went to college and I started meeting new people and I started taking classes, I really got into religion. And so both of my degrees, actually my bachelor's and my master's degree, are in religion, and I have a master's degree in Islam. And so this was very different from my family's entire professional life. My mom was a pharmacist. My dad was a fisheries biologist with the Department of Natural Resources. My brother's an electrical engineer. My husband's into computer science, and it was just very different from everything else, everyone else in my family. And I remember my parents saying, "What are you going to do with it?" And I said, "Well, I'll make it work." But I think one of the reasons that it really attracted me was because I maintain, and I still maintain, that understanding yourself and understanding individuals' religious beliefs will help you understand who they see themselves as in the world, and the choices that they decide to make to live their lives. And when I got into my PhD work, I decided to go in adult education because I had been teaching religion for quite a while. And I had noticed that in the classroom, when people were able to engage with practitioners of other religions, and I taught at a college in Gwinnett, Georgia, and it was a very diverse student base as far as religion goes, as far as Georgia is concerned. So they were able to actually meet people that were practicing Jews and practicing Muslims and practicing Hindus and practicing Buddhists in ways that they probably hadn't done so before. And their viewpoints of these religions, not just from reading the textbooks, not just from listening to me, not just from watching the 10-minute clip of the PBS video I decided to show about Hajj or something like that, is actually having conversations with these people in class that made them see or think about these religions differently, and also made them think about their own beliefs differently or more deeply, and not necessarily that this changed their viewpoints. That wasn't the goal, but it made them encounter their viewpoints in ways that they hadn't done so before. And so this led me to look into adult education, and particularly in transformative learning. And so my interest is in my content interest is in how conversations, particularly difficult conversations with members of other religions, can be transformative. What do people learn not only about themselves, but also about others when they engage in these somewhat, or sometimes very often, difficult conversations? And then how do we engage in these difficult conversations? So it's not only the what do people learn, but the how do they learn? And so as a qualitative methodologist, this led me to my interest in subjectivity and reflexive practice. And this is something that we'll talk more about as we go along, but this importance of critical reflection. And it's not only that in religion, you must understand who you are and what you believe in order to, I don't want to say calmly, but more coherently engage with members of other traditions. It's very difficult to engage with someone who believes and behaves very differently than you if you feel threatened or you are uncomfortable in your own beliefs. But this carries over into qualitative methodologies, because the ethical and the rigorous researcher is the reflexive researcher, right? This researcher who's able to engage with and able to practice critical reflection throughout the research project. So from beginning to end. And I'm starting to see and really promote in some recent writing that reflexivity is a process, right? It's not a product. It's not a methodological checkbox. It's not something you do at the very beginning. I wrote my subjectivity statement, I'm done, right? Like I did it. And it's actually from beginning to end to the research project. And it ties in with a lot of what you said, Anna, and the importance of it, in that, we have to have this reflection throughout the entire process to engage with our participants, engage with ourselves, engage with the context of the research, to understand not only how we portray it in our research, but how it is portrayed to us and how we make meaning from that portrayal as the instrument in the research. And so that's kind of where I started and how I got to where I am, and looking at some of these things. And I think that one of the main things that Anna and I wanted to go into is talking about this idea of the importance of critical self-reflection, the practice of reflexivity. In my understanding of reflexivity is it's not just, oh, I thought about things, and so here's what I think about them, but it necessitates action, right? It necessitates some sort of change, some sort of, engagement or action with your research project, with your participants, with your data, with your analysis, whatever that may be. But talking about critical reflection with early career researchers. And Anna, I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about critical self-reflection and empowering early career researchers. We've talked a little bit about that, and if you could tell me some more about your work to do that in your journey.
Great, thanks so much, Liz. It's always really wonderful to hear the story, right? This is where you grew up, what has informed your work and who you are. And so that critical self-reflection, right, that you were emphasizing, this is what I last wrote about and spoke about at this conference. So it's about this intersection on, the questions. So the book, Questions in Qualitative Social Justice Research. And this was talking about in multicultural context. So this draws from, I saw a question from Fiona about how deep an understanding of others' cultures, religion, societies do you feel researchers need to have? And then the rest of it, I would kind of stop at that point. The rest says to be able to interpret the experience of others. So I would say actually, so instead of moving into the interpreting, this is that first part. That's brilliant. That's a brilliant, critical self-reflective question that I could ask myself, right? How deep is my understanding of this situation, of this culture, of this interaction, of this place? That helps reflect back on me, right? So what is my connection to the place? And so with this last book that I wrote for Routledge, along with Nettie Boivin, each chapter talks about and has questions to critically reflect on, right? What kind of power do I have? So I could think about that in my interaction in any community. How do I know what power do I have, right? And in what kinds of ways do I have that power? And when does it come out? And so these are questions that aren't just yes and no, right? Do I have enough power? Do I have too little power, right? Okay, what does it really mean? And they're questions that others can't really answer for us. And that's where my work in this last book was. It all emerged from working with early career researchers, working with graduate students, and their questions, right? They're asking, did I build enough trust? Right? I'm not sure if I did, right? Do I have enough participants? Okay, well, let's think about it. What does it really mean? What are you trying to understand? What have you actually heard from these other people? What did it feel like when you were in that, interview, participant observation, focus group, to help you understand, right? So the person themselves, the researcher, as you mentioned, Liz, right? The researcher as instrument. What does it really mean to be in this situation, and how can I develop myself in better ways, right? So I put better in quotes because I define it a certain way. I define it as being more socially just, and social justice for me as a qualitative researcher. So I think of qualitative social justice research, and for me within social justice is also economic justice and also environmental justice. And so what does it mean? How can I become better, right? And so by asking questions are part of the ways that I find that we can become better as researchers, as methodologists, as people in the world, right? And so some of these other points, so you brought up as great, Liz, where you talked about, awareness, right? So to be aware of who I am, encouraging then other students, right, early career researchers, to be aware of that and to recognize that, okay, so some people feel maybe shy of some privilege they might have, or privilege they don't have, or positioning in the world. Okay, Well, it doesn't mean that you have to tell everyone about it, right? That may not end up in, the article you write or in the dissertation you write, yet recognizing it, seeing it, and talking with someone, maybe that's the advisor, maybe that's a friend, to then just see, okay, this is where I am. And now what does it mean when I interact with somebody else, when I go into that community? So back to this question then, right? How deep an understanding of other cultures do I need to have? This is about, I would say that I can never know enough about somebody else's culture or their understanding. My point is not to interpret their experience. What I'm trying to do, and there is always some interpretation, right? Because unless I am fully co-producing it with a participant, which is a goal of a lot of the work that I'm doing, but if I can't co-produce it fully, then I'm trying to get as much of their voice there. And for me, that has involved a lot of focus on arts-based research. So photo voice that I've conducted with early career researchers. So participant researchers taking photos of their world and explaining it in their own words. Body mapping. So drawing a human body, participants become researchers and they become then the ones who are describing it. So these are participatory research practices, really important, useful in terms of being able to really engage with this critical self-reflection, empowering early career researchers. And then as the final step here, then thinking about this and the trajectory that, so I mentioned at the beginning, so hearing your story, even though I'd heard you mention it before when we first met, and it was great then, and then I hear it again, and it's a different day, right? It's a different day for me. I hear different things. I'm affected by it differently. You say it a little bit differently, right? Every day is different. And that power of stories is what I'm working to capture now in a forthcoming book that I have with Routledge, where it's the life-changing power of stories in qualitative social justice research, and thinking about that vulnerability, so the willingness to share, and the critical self-reflection as it relates then to transformative learning. So through hearing other people's stories, then I suggest, and we can see the ways in which I can make myself a better researcher. I can learn from your experience. Oh, great, that worked really well. Oh, that was a hiccup in the process. All right, that you're willing to share with me, and okay, I can do something differently, or I can try to, or see how I might, readjust myself. So that's my general overview there. And then I would love to hear your thoughts, Liz, now.
Anna, there are so many things in there that I think are so important to note, particularly for both novice and experienced researchers. And this is something that we're thinking about is everyone has these questions, right? We all have it from the beginning to the end to the research project, and recognizing and encountering those questions and those answers to those questions helps this reflexive practice and this critical self-reflection throughout the process of a research project. And Anna, you talked about these reflective questions that you have, you've asked in your text, and you have your students think about, and in my classes and in my qual class, and every single activity, my students have to ask questions. They have to ask questions of themselves based on their field experiences, based on their readings, based on the reflection that they've done, and then they ask questions that they actually want me to answer. So these are two different sets of questions, right? They're questions that, okay, technically I want the answer to this question, I want the answer from a methodologist. And then these questions, I'm not expecting you to answer. These questions are the ways that I'm engaging with my process, I'm engaging with my data, I'm engaging with my analysis, and they're ways that I am actually not only interrogating the process of research, but interrogating myself within that process as the instrument. And so these questions, I think, are so important for the process of research because they show reflexive practice, but they also show how a researcher continues to engage with every stage of the research project throughout the research project. And this is, we talk about how data collection and analysis and qualitative research is iterative, right? And it's recursive, and it's a lot of the times it's inductive. And so these questions allow you to, look at your data, look at yourself, look at your participants and how you're engaging with them and how you're making meaning from them, and use the answers to those questions to refine your project as you move forward through your project, to finally end with the end product of reporting and findings, and noting that that may not even be the end. It may continue this process. And so when you were talking, Anna, I thought about this article that I read recently by Bishoping, and it's called Revisiting a Boy Named Jim, Using Narrative Analysis to Prompt Reflexivity. And so it made me think about, what you were talking about, the power of stories, and working with other cultures. So many other cultures that storytelling is just an inherent and an integral part of what they do. And we've got a name for it, right? Qualitative research, we've called it narrative research, but it's something that's been around forever and ever and ever. And so we've got this methodological name, but for so many people, that's how they express meaning from the world. And this is why I think in qualitative research, almost every aspect, whether you're doing a narrative study or not, has some component of storytelling in it, right? Because this is how people express their meaning in the world. But in this article by Bishoping, she lists out these reflexive questions to ask, not only of yourself, but as of the narrative itself. And so kind of the whole point is that these questions, reflexivity in this case, in looking at the narrative, is the practice of understanding how your own positions, your own subjectivities, and your own, preconceptions, biases, your own understandings of, cultures, religions, or societies, bringing in what Fiona mentioned, how they actually influence how we interpret, analyze, and report the stories, how we make meaning from what other people have said. And that is, engaging with these stories in a way that we filter them, right? We filter them through our own lenses and our own experiences. And reflexive practice helps us be more aware of that. And, all researchers, like I said, we all have these questions, we all have these hiccups. I can think of multiple aspects of my projects where I was, with another with my methodologist or a more senior researcher that I'm working on, asking these questions. I still have them, and I hope that I'll always have them, because it shows engagement with what you're doing. And so, we can connect these experiences, right? We can connect our questions with our approach for transformative learning and our approach for reflexive practice. But, to add my 2 cents on Fiona's question, you have some sort of base knowledge, but it's really both of you are learning as you're going. It's not just learning about, I have an immense amount of academic knowledge about religions, right? I've got 2 degrees. My master's degree is in Islam. I've taken so many courses. I've, read so many books. I've talked to so many people. But when I sat in these interfaith dialogue sessions, I learned so much from a personal side, and it's a window into somebody's life that you don't get from a book, and you don't get from reading an article, and you don't get from listening to a podcast or watching a documentary. You get that through engagement. And so just like Anna said, I don't know that there's ever enough. You have the understanding that you have, and you recognize it for what it is, and you go into a research project knowing that you're going to learn and grow throughout, and that you should be aware of the framework that you are using to learn, and not let that framework constrain your learning, in a sense, and not let it prevent you from growing. And I see we've got another question in the chat. Think about the synergies of this way of approaching the topic to qualitative methods, which, as we know, is vast and varied field. Indeed, it is. So, to what extent do researchers working in a particular methodological context benefit from deep understanding of how qualitative research is done in other contexts? So, Christina, thank you for your question, and I'm gonna try to answer it through my interpretation of what it might mean. Are you asking about transferring methodological knowledge from one context to another in qualitative research? Can you tell me a little bit more about what you're asking? Or if Anna, you have an answer, jump in.
I'd love to hear what Christina, what you were thinking about. I was starting to think about the cultural transferring, right? Okay, so I work in the Central Asian context, and right, Liz, you're multi-religious context and in the U.S., right? So then, what does that look like? I think another question. Christina, do you want to unmute and clarify?
Yeah,
if you're able to. Or we could each try to maybe your interpretation, Liz, and then I can jump in. We can move into the next direction and or another question.
Yeah, I mean, I can try. I mean, I think that, and I work with a colleague of mine across campus who's in sociology, and how, no, we didn't hear you, Christina. How they do, sociologists do qualitative research is great. Thank you, Christina. I'm gonna try to talk from my understanding. We'll see how it goes. How they do qualitative research, and they are focused on what's an appropriate end and things like that, is different from some of the training that I've gotten in education as a field. But what works for them has been very interesting, and I think that it has expanded my methodological knowledge of qualitative research, and not necessarily what's more appropriate or what's not, but what these boundaries are for rigorous and ethical research in other areas. And I can see these boundaries start to blur and build on one another, so that I think qualitative research cannot or should not be focused in a specific discipline, right? Call research and participatory project, very different from. Yes. I mean, like I said, I don't think that qualitative research should be constrained by a discipline or constrained by a methodology. And I've seen this, in one of the articles that I read over from Anna. She did a methodology, followed a study following a specific methodology, but brought in an analysis method from another methodology, and we can blend these methods. Maybe I'm doing a descriptive project, but I'm bringing over axial coding from grounded theory. I think this is what you did. You brought over axial coding from grounded theory. I didn't have to do a grounded theory project to do axial coding, right? Some of these methodologies blend and enhance one another. I don't necessarily have to be doing a purely arts-based research project to incorporate third objects or incorporate photos or incorporate body mapping into the project. And I think that when we constrain ourselves to what's normal from one particular methodology, I'm doing a narrative study, so I can do interviews, and I might do one other thing, but that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do what is within the boundaries of this methodology. I think that because personal experiences are so varied and expressive, and qualitative research is supposed to explore these experiences and make meaning from them, that we constrain our research in ways that the real world that we're trying to represent is not constrained. Anna, that's yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Liz. That touched upon a lot of things that I hadn't articulated yet, right? This starts for me to think about the ways in which, so my PhD was in interdisciplinary learning and teaching, and my master's was interdisciplinary as well, and so was my bachelor's. So very much my training has been on the ways in which we can bring together different disciplinary knowledge. And I could think about this within research world, within qualitative research. Okay, these different ways of being. So, okay, here's participatory, here's this, you mentioned grounded theory, Liz, you mentioned, here are these other different ways of doing things. And that that we know that just going about things in one particular way does not answer all questions. And this is whether in research, whether in the what we can think about is these wicked problems, something that Donna Mertens talks about a lot, and where, you know, this is examining these worldwide issues, right? So COVID, right? Like, we're not solving COVID by just looking at things from one perspective, right? So the health perspective also intersects with education, or access to education, for instance. And then how do we get the access to education? Well, we need technology. And how do we get the access to technology to understand that? So as we can start to develop and recognize that there's different ways of seeing the world, we can have better understandings of how to address, how to, Liz, you were saying, to, you know, show this personal experience, to help interpret it and be the voice, right? Help amplify, as I like to think about that, you know, I focus on, so equity and inclusion and highlighting voice of those who have been marginalized and oppressed and colonized. How do we amplify their voice and actually get others' voices then out there in such a way that it's also, it's not just me, right? And this is where also the future of the qualitative social justice research for me aligns with the work of Donna Mertens, where she talks about coalition building and that we're making changes, right? So what happens afterward? And this is where, you know, Liz, your work touches upon this also, where it's like, okay, well, this interfaith dialogue, it's not just, okay, now we've met each other and now we're done, right? It's you know, it's beyond that, right? And, you know, so as we learn more about ourselves and learn more about each other, then we can look to answer these questions that haven't been answered, and to help those who are, you know, are looking to have their voices heard in different ways. And I guess then there was one other part of that I was thinking that, Sharon Ravitch at the University of Pennsylvania. So she's a qualitative methodologist, and she's talked about, and I love meeting with her, and she talked about that you don't have to know everything, right? And it was a great reminder for me as an early career researcher that I don't have to be the specialist in everything, right? So if I, you know, so I specialize in arts-based research. Great. I don't specialize in discourse analysis. I can go to somebody else for that, right? I can talk to, you know, Liz, right? I'd love to work with you, Liz, and we can do something where we complement each other, right? We don't have to both know everything, right? And the rest of y'all that are here, so 66 other people right now, right? Like, we can work together to bring our knowledge together to make something bigger and better and brighter, right? The cultures, right? Each of these different cultural insights. And this is part of the thing that I've written about also, like how to have multicultural, you know, focus groups. What does that mean? What is, you know, even if we're talking about culture, where does culture, right, begin and end? This is a lot of, you know, anthropology has discussed this for ages. And thinking about that, and how do we address then kind of this next, you know, our final point that we were going to get into briefly before kind of opening up to just everyone, is these ideas of hiccups in research, right? And this connects to y'all's questions, right, about culture. And, you know, for me, I'll mention briefly, and then I'll pass over to you, Liz. So some of these hiccups have been working across cultures, and some of those cultures can be in the same space, right, in the same university, and yet there's different understanding, maybe in different disciplines, about how you go about research, right? How do you have a team work together? And one team's really clear, like, we need to, you know, they prioritize maybe their methodology first, and another team says, no, we need to look at our research questions. Another team says, no, we need to look first at only the literature, and we need to be deductive. No, we need to be inductive. So what do? Right? How do you work across these interdisciplinary teams, which is something that I explored a bit when I first came to Kazakhstan and wrote about that. And yet there's still always hiccups, right? And one of the hiccups in my research was I had this planned study. So me and a couple colleagues in the US, and then I was out in Kazakhstan, we're doing this online study of mothers in academia. And we recruited through Facebook groups in particular that focused on mothers in academia. This seemed straightforward. I was a participant, had been a longtime member of these communities. We'd planned having, at the time, Skype interviews. So this was, you know, before Zoom took off. And all these women said, oh yeah, I want to answer your question. Great, here. And they would start to text to me or my colleagues, or they would email us. Yeah, I've had this experience. Let me tell you about it. And we kept on trying to stop them and say, wait, let's set up an interview, right? Like, we had submitted ethics forms. This is how we're going to do it. And they said, oh, sorry, I don't have time for the video interview. So we were confronted with, what we ended up, calling it a quote failure in research, because that's what it initially felt like, failure in research. Instead, we ended up realizing, and have written about this in an article about rigid flexibility, that, oh, maybe we could look at it a different way, right? Business world looks at failures as opportunities, right? Oh, okay, well, something didn't work. What is it? And Norma Rahm talked about this. She came to one of our presentations and she said, well, y'all were listening to your participants, so they couldn't do interviews. Okay, so instead we started texting with them because that's what they wanted, right? And we did that after going back to the ethics board and requesting it and making sure that, okay, this is still following guidelines, right? Ethical guidelines of our universities. And participants started texting to us and they were sharing the information, and it was just in this other format. And so it was a hiccup. It was initially viewed as a failure, and we shared about it. And thankfully, we were at a position in our career that we could share about it where we felt safe. And so talked about this in terms of at the beginning about vulnerability and what's safe and who can talk about things, and shared it in a particular, special issue of failures in research. And so that also provided other context of us being safer to be able to share it in that way. And, that ultimately, or we hope that helps to forward methodological research and for other people to recognize that it's okay to have hiccups. We all have hiccups in research. We all have failures, whether perceived or actual or however you want to define it. The more that we can safely share about it, the more we can learn from each other. The same way that we're talking back about, stories and transformative learning from these experiences. And that's what can lead to then more culturally relevant research. All right, Liz, over to you.
I think that what I'd like to add to what you just said, Anna, is that I think it's really easy to forget when you're reading these beautifully polished research reports or this wonderful book that someone put together, that research is messy, right? It's so messy. And like, you have this beautiful plan. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. And then you get out in the field and you're like, yeah, that's so unreasonable. Right? Like, it can't happen. And so then you adapt and you move and you change to what is reasonable. Anna said that they didn't have time to do the video data. They had to collect data over text. It's not how she planned to do it. They had this great idea. We're going to do video interviews. It's going to work out great. And it didn't. And so one of my professors in my graduate program, Kathy Ralston, told me once when I was sitting in her office, like, not in tears, but almost in tears. I think this was one of the times that I didn't cry. That one of my observations was just, I felt an utter failure. It had gone so poorly. The event that I wanted, like the real event that I wanted to do, had been canceled. So I had to scramble for some other side thing that wasn't nearly as good. And I didn't think I was going to get any of the data that I needed. And I was going to have to prolong data collection and I was very upset. And she said, Liz, it's never a failure. It's never a failure. You can always use it. You may not be able to use it in the way that you thought you were going to use it, and it may not have fit into the general framework and plan that you had made for data collection, but you can use it. And lo and behold, I did. I used it in a different way. It wasn't as generative or as robust as I had wanted, but it wasn't a failure, right? Not only was the data itself not a failure, but the experience that I gained through the field observation informed what I did later in the project. So while it's messy and while there are hiccups and while you have these questions, I think that that's something that I keep reminding myself over and over, is that it's not a failure. And that's one of the things that I think is particularly important when we want to design culturally relevant and also culturally responsive research, is that we have to embrace this messiness And we have to have this rigid flexibility that Anna mentioned, or our research can't be culturally relevant. It can't be culturally responsive. It can't, amplify or give space for the voices of people who their voices get overlooked or misheard or muted, or any of those words. We can't possibly do that. We can't possibly design research methods that use relevant sources of data and relevant methodologies if we don't have a plan that has blurred edges, basically. And I think that a lot of what Anna has said is enhancing that idea. And so, these hiccups in designing culturally relevant research, I think the hiccups are just an inherent part of research in particular, but also in culturally relevant research. And that as researchers, we need to be prepared for the fact that they're going to be there. And we have to be humble enough and vulnerable enough in ourselves to encounter them and be aware of them when they happen, and be reflexive enough to change when they do. And I think that's what leads to truly relevant and responsive research.